Good morning and welcome to NHFIC's State of the Nation's Housing 21-22 webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Tori Condon, NHFIC's Director of Corporate Affairs, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar and panel discussion. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present today. Now for some housekeeping. Please stay on mute and enter your questions via the Q&A function on the bottom toolbar. Questions will be held until the panel discussion, when we'll aim to answer as many of your questions as possible. I would like to say a special thank you to NHFIC's Chair, Adrian Harrington, and to our board members who have joined us today. Now, first introduced in 2020, the State of the Nation's Housing is NHFIC's flagship research report. The report provides an analysis into housing supply, demand and affordability across Australia. This morning we will hear from Hugh Hartigan, NHFIC's Senior Advisor, about the key themes explored in State of the Nation's Housing 21-22 report. Hugh's presentation will be followed by an interactive panel discussion where we'll be joined by Mirvac CEO, Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz, and Boral CEO, Zlatko Todorcevski. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on the website. I'd now like to introduce NHFIC CEO, Nathan Dalbon. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Tori. And thanks to everyone for attending today's webinar. And in particular, I'd like to extend my appreciation to today's panelists, Susan, Zlatko and Hugh. Today's webinar is to discuss NHFIC's second State of the Nation report, which examines the outlook for housing supply and demand in Australia. The release of this year's report is framed against the backdrop of another year of dealing with COVID, a major war in the Ukraine and resulting global instability. In Australia, over 12 months of exceptionally strong house price growth across most housing markets in Australia, supply chain constraints, which have seen significant cost escalation in building materials. Net overseas migration is expected to recover strongly after reaching historic lows. The prospect of higher interest rates as governments around the world wind back monetary stimulus. And in Australia, there is a looming federal election as well as a number of state elections with housing expected to figure prominently. NHFIC's research team has been established to examine housing supply, demand and affordability. We've released 10 research publications in just over 2 years. We focus our research around the principles of quality, accessibility and relevance. Critical to delivering on these principles is our close collaboration with housing stakeholders, many of whom are present today. I look forward to today's discussion on the outlook for housing in Australia, and I now hand over to Hugh for his presentation.
Thanks, Nathan. And just while I get my slides up, I hope everyone can see these. But look, welcome everyone. I'm Senior Advisor Research at NHFIC, and I'm really here just to give a bit of a scene setter, a prelude to what I think will be a fascinating discussion with Susan and Zlatko. I also kind of welcome them and give them my thanks. I think it's going to be a really fascinating discussion. So look, I will just briefly take people through some of our key themes of our second State of the Nation's Housing report that was released 2 to 3 weeks ago, and then just run people through some of more our high level kind of 10-year projections of housing supply and household formation. As Nathan said, it's been an incredible sort of time in housing markets. So just moving along, Nathan alluded to some of these things, but we've had an exceptionally strong period of housing construction, partly owing to a lot of the stimulus that's been rolled out, whether interest rates or a lot of the government programs, particularly things like JobKeeper and even Home Builder, things that buffeted household incomes, kept unemployment lower than I think most expected. And this allowed people to sort of pay their bills and particularly the rents and mortgages. And so I think we saw a far less sort of negative impact on the housing market than we may have imagined. This has been at the same time an incredible backdrop, once in a century shock to population growth. Something we haven't seen sort of in our lifetimes, and I'll turn a bit to that in a second. But look, I was reflecting before I came on here, just if we return our minds back to sort of that early 2020 period when I actually went back and read some, economic notes, and there were a lot of people suggesting that, we were going to see price falls and not a strong construction, etc. And I think it's fair to say, in retrospect, it's easy to sometimes overestimate the sort of negative impacts of lower population growth, but also to, we probably all underestimated to some extent the sheer magnitude and size of the stimulus that was rolled out during this period. So we're now heading back into sort of more normal times. As Nathan was saying, we are expecting net overseas migration to bounce back, notwithstanding, I think, some ongoing risks around COVID. One of the inescapable themes of COVID has been this sort of regional story. There's been a lot less people moving from the regions to the cities, and a lot more people moving from the cities to the regions, which has put a lot of pressure on housing markets. I think, some of the future trends are unclear, but I'm sure our panelists will shed a bit of light on this in terms of getting their on-the-ground views. But, I think the big question I suppose everyone's asking is, do we revert back to some of those pre-pandemic urban regional trends, or are we seeing something a bit more structural? Do workplaces remain as flexible as they became during COVID? All, I think, some really interesting questions that we'll see pan out over the next few years. And just finally, on affordability, we've seen very robust price growth, the strongest price growth in 30 or 40 years. This has obviously made affordability for first home buyers more challenging. And despite some respite, particularly in cities like Sydney and Melbourne, with rents in 2020, we've really seen a lot more sort of stock absorbed over the last year, and we've seen kind of rents now sort of going up quite strongly. So I think just turning, briefly to the outlook, as I said, that stock absorption now positions us where a lot of rental markets are sort of in balance. We're going to have, probably a pretty strong influx of net overseas migration over the next few years, which could put ongoing upward pressure on rents. So look, this is just the incredible sort of population backdrop that's probably familiar to most, but it's just worth going over again. We've had 2 negative quarters of net overseas migration, something that hasn't happened in Australia for generations, but on the back of Centre for Population data, which we base our household formation numbers, we are expecting a pretty good recovery over the next few years as the restrictions are relaxed and as COVID, hopefully kind of moves a bit further back into the rear vision mirror. It's important to note though as well that whilst we're expecting population growth to recover, Australia's population is likely to be 1.5 million people smaller by 2031. So that's a permanent shock to the overall size of Australia's population. So that was the backdrop, but just turning briefly to, this is getting into some of our projections. And I think on the back of that net overseas migration recovery, we're going to see a strong sort of, we're not going to have that negative impact of net overseas migration on household formation. Our projections suggest we're expecting more than 1.7 million households to form. And I think one of the interesting stories is, with the backdrop of sort of the ageing population and that demographic story still playing out in the background, we're seeing very strong, or expecting to see very strong growth in lone person households. And again, I think that's got implications, for the types of housing we need, particularly sort of more sort of higher density. And just to give a bit of perspective to the lone person households, on the recent census, the current stock of lone person households made up about 25%. And we're expecting lone person households to form about 35% of the growth over the next decade. So these are our national projections put out in our report, and I think the key thing to note here, these are net additions, so these are net of demolitions. Our modelling report is really about showing what is that sort of net new supply coming through and how that matches up with our sort of net, new household formation. And I think, sort of as has been alluded to, we're expecting a pretty strong pipeline coming through, certainly in 2022 and 2023. Part of this will be dependent on the pathway of interest rates, as Nathan was alluding to. But certainly we are expecting, certainly in 2022 and 2023, a very strong pipeline to come through with 550,000 net new dwellings from 2022 to 2024. I think one of the takeaways of this chart is really just to sort of, make the sort of observation, which is supply has, been historically high. It is historically high quite now. But if you look at where we would have been in a normal population growth scenario, it would have only just been enough to cover new rates of household formation. So I think one of the stories here really is we're building, pretty well at the moment, but really we need to kind of keep sustaining these levels to ensure that the balance of supply and household formation doesn't exacerbate affordability over time. This is just breaking down into the segments, some really interesting stories in here. Detached saw a much bigger take up of home builder. So we're expecting historically high levels of detached in 22, 23, and then we're expecting detached to fall away back to sort of pre-pandemic levels over the years after that. I think probably one of the more interesting stories in our report is the multi-unit. So these are the apartments and medium density. We're not expecting as big a take-up over the next few years. In fact, one of the points we make in our report is that we're expecting a bit of a shortfall of apartments and medium density over the coming years. And this is likely to occur at a time when we're going to get that influx of net overseas migration coming sort of, certainly beyond 24, 25. And our numbers actually show that beyond the point at which NOM is expected to recover back to pre-pandemic levels, we're expecting new household formation to outpace new supply of apartments and medium density by about 77,000 dwellings. So that's a pretty significant shortfall. Just turning very briefly, I won't go through all of our cities in detail, but look, there's some pretty stark stories here in Sydney and Melbourne. The cities that were certainly hit harder by that sort of closed borders and net overseas migration. They weren't getting that influx of international students and all those skilled workers that typically reside in these cities. And at the same time, we've got a pretty strong pipeline coming through. So you can see the uptick in Sydney. That's going to remain elevated for a couple of years. Supply was coming off a much higher base in Melbourne, but again, supplies are remaining pretty high. And again, I think a similar story here to the national story, which is, supply, unless we kind of keep supply at these current levels, we're likely to see it dip quite significantly below new rates of household formation. Just give you one example, Melbourne from 24, 25 out to 2032, we're expecting household formation to outpace new supply by about 61,000 dwellings. And just finally, the final sort of theme I'll touch on, it's sort of got two themes in one here, but it's really this sort of affordability story. We've seen this very, very strong price growth come through in the cities, but particularly in the regions. In our work, we sort of have been drawing on sort of the use of Lorenz curves. For people that don't know what they are, they just give a bit of a deeper distributional insight into affordability because they allow us to look at what proportion of the existing housing stock is affordable for each household income level. So, for example, the chart on the left, essentially what it shows is if you're at the 60th percentile of household income, you can afford around 10% of properties. And so that demonstrates that Sydney's a very kind of highly challenged market in terms of first home buyers. There's been a bit more deterioration over the last year, but on the right-hand side, the big story again has been this regional story. You can see pretty much at all income levels, affordability for first home buyers has deteriorated quite significantly. And again, I think this is one of the big stories of COVID, and I look forward to sort of what our panelists have to say about this. Look, I'll leave it there. Our report, I encourage everyone to go and have a read and also to reach out to us anytime if you want to have a chat about it. So Turi, on that note, back to you.
Thanks, Hugh. I'd like to welcome Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz and Zlatko Todachevsky, who are joining Nathan and Hugh on the panel today. First to Susan. Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz has been CEO and Managing Director of Mirvac for a decade. Prior to this, Susan was Managing Director at LaSalle Investment Management, where she was responsible for the core investment accounts and funds business lines of the European region, as well as for the operations of the business. Zlatko Todachevsky joined Boral as CEO and Managing Director in 2020, with a 30-year executive career spanning oil and gas, logistics, and steel building product sectors. Prior to Boral, Zlatko was on the board of Adelaide Brighton Limited and held senior executive roles at BHP Petroleum's business, including CFO of Energy at BHP. His later positions included CFO for Oil Search Limited and CFO for Brambles. Now, welcome to you both, and thank you, Nathan and Hugh. And we all have our panelists on. Now, moving to our panel discussion, it's great to see so many interesting questions for our panelists coming through. Please continue to ask your questions via our Q&A function. Now to start, Hugh's presentation touched on one of the big themes during the pandemic, the move of people to the regions and less people moving to the cities. Susan, could I ask you first, what's your view on what this means for the future of cities going forward?
It's an absolutely fascinating question. And in fact, we were so fascinated by this question, we wrote a paper on it last year, really sparking off the late Richard Rogers, Lord Richard Rogers, famously said that cities are the birthplace of our civilization and the engine of our economy, but cities don't just happen, they are made. And with all the discussion about we're all going to move to Byron Bay and Geelong, we were asking the question, are our cities getting unmade? Is that long historical arc towards urbanisation and agglomeration that has created wealth for millennia, really, is that in reverse? And so we wrote a paper about it because we wanted to explore what was going on. And the long and the short of it is it makes a big difference to the regions. Intrastate migration is not new, and it's highly correlated with affordability. So when Sydney gets unaffordable, people move out. And I think more people moved in 2017 than 2020, for example. It makes a huge difference, as we've just seen in those charts, to the regions. A small, relatively small influx puts enormous pressure on housing stock and infrastructure, makes almost no difference to Sydney and Melbourne. And so we firmly believe that for a whole host of reasons, including the proven ability of cities and agglomeration of people being together, that is the generator of wealth in our economies, and that the cities will continue to perform that function. And as with the borders reopened and migration starting again, I think we will see quite different conditions in our cities in the near to medium term. But it is an absolutely fascinating question. What has changed? What is permanent? How will we reshape our cities? And we concluded our paper by saying that cities aren't being unmade, but they need to be remade. That obsolescence is going to accelerate post-COVID because things just simply won't be fit for purpose into the future.
So Susan, when you're saying they're being remade, when do you expect that vibrancy perhaps to bounce back?
I think we will surprise, maybe this is me just being optimistic, I think we will surprise on the upside on that, barring what we can never see in terms of what's coming with COVID, and it's certainly, I'd love it to be in the rear vision mirror, but it's not there yet. I think we'll see there's a very strong desire for people to get back together. I don't know what it's like in Borrell's office as Latco, but it's a bit like a high school reunion here at Mirvac at the moment. People really enjoying being together for the first time really in 2 years. Now, we've been running this business largely remotely for almost well over 2 years now, and people realise how much is missing in that format. So I think we will surprise on the upside with people wanting to come together again in workplaces, come into the city for all the amenities that the city has to offer, and the addition of migrants and students will increase the vibrancy in our cities. So not tomorrow, not next week, but certainly within 6 months, I think we will see increased vibrancy coming back into our cities.
And Zlatko, you're at the coalface with building materials. What are you seeing with these trends?
I think our view, Tori, would be pretty similar to the way Susan described it. I don't see it as an either or. I think both can coexist. And we saw the migration out of metropolitan areas early in the pandemic, particularly when people realised they had flexibility in their working arrangements. And I live in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales, so I've seen it firsthand. There's been just a dramatic increase in the number of people that have particularly moved out of Sydney down there. I don't think that'll necessarily change, but equally, I think, as Susan described it really well, I think there will continue to be vibrancy in metropolitan areas, particularly as you think about multi-residential, whether it's medium or high density, continuing to grow. You see a lot of return of net migration, particularly from overseas happening. That'll tend to overpopulate in terms of the cities relative to the region. So I think we'll absolutely see that return. But it's just been a fascinating trend to watch because there are some things that need to change if we will continue to see that regional growth. And that'll include infrastructure, which frankly hasn't been sized to deal with the magnitude of the moves. It'll include businesses like ours that will need to ensure we've got the networks to support that. Once again, I don't see it as an either or. I think we will continue to support metropolitan growth, but recognise there is a trend here around regional growth that we just can't ignore.
You've had the business in the US until recently. Are there any trends around this that you've seen playing out overseas that might come to Australia?
Oh, look, there's a couple of things I think might be relevant for Australia as well, Tori. And one is part of the rebound we've seen in North American housing construction, whether it's detached housing or medium and high density, is off the back of a period of really low stock rebuild. So almost went for a decade after the GFC where they didn't replenish their stock. And whether it was rejuvenation, demolition of existing buildings or expansion on city fringes and the like, that has just been a strong trend in the last 18 months. And as you said, we sold our business into that really positive market. I think we'll see that in Australia as well. So people are looking for more affordable housing. yes, regions are a little bit more affordable today, but construction methodologies need to change to make it more affordable. And I think we'll see a return to the trend of medium and high density living, not just off the back of net migration, but just the trends that we're seeing with the high cost of detached housing.
And Nathan, what are you seeing out there?
Well, a couple of observations, Turi. So one, I think the return of net overseas migration, in particular international students, will have a major impact, particularly on Sydney and Melbourne, where a lot of the international students went. I think in terms of that either or, I agree with the comments that are made in terms of where we're going to settle. It's going to be different to the work practices that we had previously, but it's going to be it'll be an interesting test to see what that arrangement is. And it's, from our own experiences, it's probably likely to be some sort of hybrid type environment where people are spending time in the office and also working remotely. But then you need the infrastructure to also facilitate that if people are living in regions, not just from a road network, but also IT and everything else, as many of us have experienced in terms of the frustrations associated with IT at various times. I think the other observation, Turi, is just, I think it's a good thing that we have seen a move to the regions. When you think about there's been many attempts at trying to promote regionalisation at a government policy level. And what has finally probably worked has been COVID in terms of actually promoting the movement to the regions. Hopefully we can have some other policies that could lead to further regionalisation, but I think at the end of the day, it's a good thing that these communities have benefited from the influx of people.
Yes, COVID certainly caused a seismic shift. Hugh, do you have a comment on this, on the cities and regions?
Oh, nothing. I mean, agree with everything everyone said, basically. But look, I mean, I suppose bringing it back to sort of why people have typically moved in and lived in the cities is because that's typically where the jobs have been. Is that really going to change over the long run? Probably not over the short to medium term. So I think one of the more interesting stories is, particularly in a really tight job market, how do employers change the way they kind of remunerate people? How do they think about flexibility? That flexibility thing is going to be a really fascinating thing. I mean, Nathan alluded to whether we move back to a hybrid, but I think it's going to be interesting to see how much of that flexibility becomes a really competitive angle in terms of what employers offer.
Okay. You all touched on what an extraordinary period we've had. I'd just like you now perhaps to take out your crystal balls and what do you see happening in the housing markets, or the outlook, I suppose, for the housing markets over the next 12 months? Given in the background we have the prospect of rising interest rates and global instability. Zlatko, maybe you'd like to take that one first?
Yeah, let me start. Look, I think, and it's similar to what Hugh was showing in some of the charts there, Terry, but we do see a levelling off and then probably a decline in detached housing over the next 12, 18 months or so. And we saw the spike really off the back of home builders, so not necessarily sustainable, but very, very grateful as an industry to see that level of support for construction during COVID. But offsetting that decline in detached, we are seeing early stages from a lot of our customers, including Susan's business, where there's a lot more interest in multi-residential at the moment and in metropolitan areas. And we do see that as something that's not just aspirational. We are seeing a lot more of our customers getting into the planning phase, commencing these projects. So I would see a fairly significant rebound in multi-res relative to where we've been over the last couple of years, probably in the next 6 to 12 months, and then continuing on for the next couple of years, which frankly is very helpful when you think about the chart that Hugh showed with that delta on multi-res, particularly if net overseas migration kicks in. On the issue of affordability, though, I might have an unpopular or different view here because I'm old enough to remember mortgage rates in the high teens back in the late 80s. So yes, we are probably going to see increases in interest rates, and yes, it's a completely different environment, but I still think housing in Australia is relatively affordable, particularly as people have rebuilt their personal balance sheets over the last 2 years. And yes, we will see rising rates, but I still think we're in a much better position than we were even 2 years ago. So I'm quietly optimistic, maybe not so quiet these days, Shuri, but optimistic about what the forward pipeline looks like, particularly in multi-residential.
Susan, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, and excuse me, my light has just turned off in the room here, so it looks like I've gone.
It's mood lighting.
Into the dark, mood lighting. Yeah. So I would largely agree with what Zlatko was saying in terms of multi-res being something that there will be and needs to be actually more supply, because we're going to get, as the report pointed out, into a position in 24, 25 where we have a very serious undersupply on the east coast of Australia for apartments. And what's really fascinating is the price differential between established housing and apartments. There we go, the lights are back on. Established housing and apartments in a given catchment is the widest it has ever been. So, for example, we're building some apartments, high-end apartments in Green Square in Sydney. The price of a 3-bedroom house in that catchment is almost double the price of a 3-bedroom apartment. And that is a very compelling customer proposition for people that have equity in their homes. They've seen the price rise over the last several years. They can release equity, live in a 3-bedroom apartment with all the amenities, stay in their local area, which they want to do. It's a trend that we see in many parts of Sydney and Melbourne, that price differential really driving interest in apartment living. And all of that discussion in 2020 about when nobody wants to live in apartments anymore because nobody wants to be together. We're certainly not seeing that on the ground. From a housing perspective, detached housing, we actually saw more sales in the last 6 months than we did in the very strong home builder period, which has surprised us because we did think it was somewhat of a pull forward, as stimulus like that often is. But certainly in our business has proven to be very resilient for first home buyers and upgraders in our land and home business. So I do see quite buoyant conditions. I agree with Zlatko that household balance sheets are in really good shape. Interest rates, while they will tick up, are still historically very low, and we're going to get migration humming again. They're all very supportive for the housing market over the next few years in our view.
So do you see a bit of a catch up then in terms of apartment prices compared to houses? I noticed you also had lone households leading the in terms of household formation.
Well, I think it depends largely on whether the established housing price comes back or the apartment price goes up, because there has to be an equilibrium there somewhere. And people always talk about average house prices. Well, there is no average house. It's the strength in the established housing market has been really concentrated at the upper end, the top quartile.
All of these placeholders, are they nothing's happening?
Deborah, can you go? There we go. Sorry, apologies.
That's all right.
Apologies for that. So the price growth has been in the top quartile. So it's not a uniform experience across the way. The other big trend I'd call out for the housing market is build to rent, which is a housing typology that we need to have in this country. We have been trying to create that sector. We've got Australia's really only first operating asset out at Sydney Olympic Park, which is now 97% let. Completely different rental proposition for customers compared to the often patchy rental experience that we've all enjoyed or not over the years as we rented apartments. And so there's a big pipeline in Australia of build to rent, which is all about providing secure homes in a rental format for people who choose not to or cannot get onto the housing ladder given the affordability challenges. And I would really hope that governments continue to support that sector as it grows out of infancy.
We have a slightly tangential question that's come from the audience from Wendy Hayhurst at Chair on that sort of theme of both rental and affordability. And Wendy says the report highlights how important the state of the rental market is to increasing numbers of Australians, and makes clear that virtually nothing in the market is affordable in the lower income quintiles. It's an open question for the panellists, but what policies do you think governments could bring forward to improve the quality of rental housing?
Well, I'll jump in and start on that one. There's plenty of things they can do to support build to rent as an institutional investment asset class around GST equalisation, land tax, managed investment trust status. As a whole raft, which they are well known. We've been putting them out there for some time as to how that could be supported. There's a lovely program that the Queensland government has put in place whereby they called on people who had build to rent assets ready to go to submit for a subsidy or an underwrite of 25% affordable apartments for key workers for 15 years. And so we submitted, and we were funded by the government to produce. We're building it at the moment at Newstead in Brisbane, and 25% of those apartments, tenure blind, will be for key workers in that local area at 25% below the market rent. Really, really simple way that the government can support starting construction, creating jobs, creating homes for renters, and particularly homes for key workers.
I mean, I suppose key workers has become a big issue. I mean, there was a front page story in the papers this morning on the difficulties key workers face. Again, open question to the panel. Do you expect that to be a continuing problem, or do you think that the developers and industry is perhaps now more conscious of this issue?
Well, I think that the report from Terry highlighted a number of things that all of us can work on, including governments. And one of the key issues or opportunities there is supply. You know, if you think, and this may not be well known, but Boral is a significant landholder across Australia. And if you think about our life cycle, we generally buy properties that are on city fringes. We produce quarry materials or concrete. And then as you get urban encroachment, we no longer need those properties, and we end up, historically, we've sold them. But what we're looking at doing is creating an annuity stream going forward. So, you know, Susan's point there around build to rent is absolutely something we're conscious of, and we want to play in that space going forward. But it's really important that governments are then focused on increasing supply. Otherwise, we are going to see a lack of affordability. And when you see planning horizons that can take 6 to 8 years to make land available, that frankly, in many cases should be made available for housing, that's not helpful. When you see planning processes for a lot of construction activities, whether it's new concrete plants or quarries taking inordinate amounts of time, that doesn't help us support that growth. And you know, a nice little statistic I'll throw out is Victoria has not approved a new quarry for 22 years. So that's a nice game you can play for a period of time, but you get to a point eventually where you don't have the materials you need to support this growth. So one of the areas, if you could wave a wand, that I'd really like to see is just planning approvals generally to free up more land and ensure we've got the construction infrastructure to support that growth.
I think that goes exactly right, Terry, that it is the #1 issue by a long way in the housing market, the state of the planning systems around the country. And there's differences between states, but in general, particularly in New South Wales, the planning pathway is convoluted, complicated, but we can do better, and we've seen it. The New South Wales government put in place during the last 2 years the fast track process to fast track things that were stuck in the system and had been stuck for years and years. And COVID gave everybody the impetus to get them unstuck, and unstuck they were, and out they came. We can do it. So it is the #1 issue, and until we get a more balanced release of land and a more straightforward, without cutting corners or creating bad product, we can do better around planning. It's the #1 issue.
Yeah. Hugh, this is something that you wrote on in the report. Would you like to just perhaps take us through some of the key findings?
Yeah, look, I think, I mean, alluding to what Nathan said earlier on, what we tried to do in this report compared to probably our first report was engage a lot more with people at the coalface. You know, we engaged a lot with the developers to really sort of try and find out, you know, where some of the bottlenecks were and where some of the supply constraints were. And it was really interesting. I mean, there's actually a couple of case studies we put in our report, which kind of goes to Zlatko's point. I mean, case studies where, you know, there are some apartment blocks in areas in Sydney where, you know, it actually can take 6 to 7 years to sort of get, you know, identification of the site and then stock to market and through all those approvals process. So if you come back to some of the projections in our report, if we're not making those decisions now and getting it right now, we're certainly going to have a pretty perverse outcomes in 3 or 4 years when that sort of population growth is going to return. And I think that's probably one of the key messages in our report. And I think just one other thing I'd mention, I think Zlatko hit on it as well. I think sometimes people get a bit confused with zoned land versus what land is actually developable and actually which land has been serviced. And this comes up a lot in our discussions. And I think that, you know, one of the ways in which we're trying to sort of look a bit deeper into this is to sort of try and provide a bit more transparency, try and get our hands on better data. We're doing some data projects at the moment, but I think particularly for some of those housing authorities, more transparency and more, you know, will obviously generate more accountability. So particularly understanding sort of, you know, lot sales, sizes, you know, what lots have actually got that infrastructure already ready to go, that can be a very, very different story to what land's actually kind of being zoned. And I think that's where sometimes where the conversation gets a bit skewed. So yeah, that's it for me, Turi.
All right. Well, look, thanks, audience, for your questions so far. And just a reminder to use our chat function or Q&A. And just letting you know that we're prioritising the questions that are on supply of housing, demand and affordability. And so I'll just go to the next question from the audience. It's from Kat Gray, and it's on the nature of demand and the impact of COVID-19. Kat asks, do you think international students will return in the same volumes? Now, we've touched on this before, but she's exploring a little more. Or have they gone to other countries in the last 2 years? Susan, is this something that you have a view on in terms of domestic versus overseas?
Yeah, I think it's really too early to call, and I'm certainly no expert in the matter of what will be the level of international students coming back into the country. And I'm sure there is a proportion of students who've elected over the last 2 years to pursue studies in other countries that didn't have closed borders for 2 years. But to the extent of that, I really have no way of knowing how meaningful that would be. But that's just one segment of the market, and with the reintroduction of skilled migration, household formation, I think that remains positive for the market. It is interesting to me what things have changed during COVID in terms of the demand profile, not just in numbers of people, but in what people are looking for, because I think we all realized that suddenly our houses, our homes had to work so hard. They had to be schools, and they had to be gyms, and they had to be restaurants, and they had to be everything, as well as your workplace, as well as your home. And so it's changed how people want apartments to be designed. A study nook isn't any good anymore because you get your husband walking behind you when you're on the Teams call. So you need an enclosed study. There's all sorts of changes in customer expectations that have come about through COVID. So it's not just a question of numbers and how many students, but in the context of a regrowing population, a looming undersupply of built form for all the reasons we've talked about, and changing customer preferences. Those, I think, are the key drivers that are coming out of how COVID has changed this market.
Yeah, so interesting to touch on actual design there, because quite a shift, or we think we've seen a shift in design. Is that what you're seeing at the coalface, that there's quite a different shift in customers' preferences for space and how space is used? And do you think that will stay? Is it structural?
I do think it's structural, and it's quite marked, and it's marked in a number of ways around the people being much more conscious around the design of the space and being much more conscious about living sustainably. I think there's been something about COVID which has said that reminded people that we need to take care of the planet. And we have seen a marked shift in our residential customers' interest and willingness to pay for sustainability features in their homes. 5 years ago, I think if we were talking sustainability to a residential customer, they heard corporate spin and green theatre, and now they don't. That has been a marked shift, and I think that is here to stay with customers wanting to live in sustainable homes and using their home to have a positive impact where they can. So I do think those things are structural. The other structural trend, and Zako touched on this in terms of construction methodologies, that we are seeing really quite significant strides towards more modular and manufactured components into houses. We're for the first time doing pod bathrooms in houses. We've done it in apartments for years, and we now can do it in houses. It's gone from 12 weeks to create a bathroom to 11 seconds to crane the bathroom into the house. It just changed the game in so many ways, from waste to truck movements to impact to safety. It's a real game changer, and I think that the continued digitization of design and forward thinking in that area is something else that is coming out of this new housing market.
Zako, you're talking to developers across the board and supplying them. What are you seeing in these trends?
Look, I have to absolutely support everything Susan just described there. If I think back to our journey over the last couple of years, or at least since I've been with Boral, just the change in focus on sustainability has been outstanding. And if you think about our industry as construction materials, I think we are the second largest emitter of carbon internationally. So you can have two reactions. One is huddle in a dark corner and hope it goes away, or face into the opportunity that creates and We took the latter path. So we are actively working on, with customers like Susan's organisation, how we support them in the deconstruction of existing buildings to make sure we separate all the different materials in an existing building. We're able to recycle 98% of those and get them back into asphalt, get it back into concrete, which I think is fantastic. We've developed a full suite of lower carbon concretes that can be used, and they can do everything from driveways to 75-storey buildings, as we've done recently in Surface Paradise. And once again, to Susan's point, 90% of those applications will either be at price parity with our existing products or a very, very imperceptible price premium. So we're taking that challenge to make sure that we can support some of those trends and make sure customers get the benefit of more sustainable products. But ultimately, what we're looking for is, frankly, zero carbon cement, which then means we don't have to think about recycling, have unique products. And that's probably a decade or so away, Turi, but I think we're on the path and have a high degree of confidence that we can make that happen.
Okay, I'll just go back to questions from the floor and a little change of pace. So Michael Bleeby from the Australian Financial Review has a question for Zlatko and Susan. Michael's question is, what effect will the Queensland New South Wales flood have on the already pressured materials and labour markets in home building? And I guess following on from Michael's question, is also interested in the impacts these types of disruptions have on the future of housing supply. Zlatko, you're on. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Jerry. I think it's a great question from Michael. And frankly, I think first of all, it's just a humanitarian disaster. So to think about everyone that's been displaced from their homes and the impact it's had in a lot of communities, thoughts are with all of those individuals and communities. In terms of the impact it has, though, is, as you would expect, as we're seeing with bushfires and other flood events historically, there's a period then of rebuilding, as well as natural demand, which we frankly felt was quite robust prior to the heavy rains and flooding we've seen recently. So that will be a challenge for the industry to be able to support. But I imagine most people will be focused on how we support the rebuilding activities relative to other work we might have been doing. If I think about our operations, touchwood, we've been fairly unimpacted. So most of our batch plants, our concrete plants, didn't get this kind of sustained impact you might have thought. A number of our quarries had some water inundation, but we'll be able to, if we're not already producing, we'll be able to produce quite quickly. So from a supply perspective, I think we'll be fine. The question mark is how quickly demand rebounds and how that demand overlay relative to the strong demand we already have is going to play out. But I think it'll be a pretty strong demand environment for at least the next 6 to 12 months.
Susan, would you like to comment?
It's a good question, Michael. There definitely has been some parts of the supply chain which have been affected by all the various things that have been going on in terms of construction shutdowns, and then having large proportions of corporate Australia furloughed when Omicron first hit, and that influenced the supply chains, and of course global disruption that we're seeing. And there have been pockets. Timber is one where there's definitely price pressure on timber. But our experience, partly because we can procure quite far into the future, given the depth of our pipeline going forward, we can procure across asset classes and out for some time. We're definitely well within our feasibilities in terms of the assumptions we had put in our feasibilities around price growth on supplies and labour. So we're very comfortable that we are individually in a good position around that, but obviously continue to watch for pockets of pressure, particularly where there will be very strong demand for trades in the areas that are being rebuilt. And I will just point out that we are using Zlatko's low carbon concrete at 80 Ann Street in Brisbane, and it's been a very, very positive experience.
It's good to hear. Now, I think I'll be in trouble if I don't ask you to take out your crystal, Susan particularly, and talk about what you think is going to happen in the housing market in terms of price growth, values growth in the next 12 months. I don't think anyone expected, even our best economists, to see what's happened in the last 18 months. So no pressure, but if you could just have a go, that would be fantastic.
My crystal ball is a little cloudy over the last couple of years. Not too sure I can rely on it. I think, to digress slightly, COVID has really stripped us of any delusion that we can predict with confidence very far into the future, because we just can't. But having said that, we'll have a stab because it's a fair question. I think it's untenable to continue to have 20% plus price growth in established housing markets for a whole host of reasons. given affordability challenges, that I don't believe that we'll continue to see that kind of pace. People have been very surprised over the last couple of years that throughout everything that has happened, we've had such strong performance. But on the other hand, we still have got migration turning on at the exact same time as we're going to have an undersupply of housing. That supply demand dynamic is pretty simple, and that produces pressure in the system, which isn't necessarily a good thing for the community as a whole. So that takes us right back again to the supply issue and the need urgently to get more supply into the market. So I'm not going to hazard a guess at a number, but I'm going to say it's the average is not going to be anywhere near 20% in our major cities.
Okay, Zlatko, would you like to have a go?
I'm exactly in the same space, Cheery. So I think, I would expect, if I look at the disruptions we've seen in international supply chains, I expect that'll settle down over the next 18, 24 months. And we'll be able to get a lot of the vehicles, et cetera, that we haven't been able to get consistently more recently. But the swing factor for me is supply. If we see a strong supply and planning response, then I don't think price increases will be as strong. If we see what we've seen historically and more recently, I think we will see some stronger prices. Hopefully it's the former, not the latter.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just take another question from the audience. Steve Mann from the UDIA asks a question on supply constraints, which is also something NHFIC looked at through its industry liaison in the report. Steve's question is, what can be done to drive more development-ready housing projects, whether that is better integration of rezoning and the provisions enabling better infrastructure like water, sewer, power, et cetera, environmental approvals? Hugh, can you touch on this first, please?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Steve. And I thank Steve for his engagement. We've had some really good engagement with UDIA on some of these issues. And one of the things we did when this issue kind of kept coming up, actually, is we did a research paper last year on developer contributions, which is, a really kind of critical area along that sort of planning and supply process. And I suppose one of the things we came away thinking about was, how many of the existing sort of suite of things that developer contributions pay for are sort of at the nexus, at the actual kind of nexus of the actual development, and how much of it isn't. And also going to things like, the messages from us really from a whole lot of developers was, it wasn't sort of a strong opposition necessarily to developer contributions, but it was, we need them to be predictable. We need kind of at the very beginning of the process, we need to know how much we're going to pay. Anyone running a business, I never have, but Zlatko and Susan do. If you've got a whole lot of unpredictability in that sort of supply process, that's ultimately going to increase margins, which feeds through to just a worse sort of housing outcome. So I think one thing I'd say about Steve is I think the New South Wales recently did a pretty good report. I'm not sure exactly where they're at re-implementing that, but I think it goes to a lot of these issues around timeliness and also making sure the enabling infrastructure is built at the appropriate time. There's no point in collecting developer contributions and then saying, oh, well, we'll deliver this sort of trunk infrastructure for, particular development in 10 years. So I think timeliness is just really critical.
Okay, would someone else like to take this? Perhaps Nathan, do you want to comment next on this?
Look, maybe just to add more, to echo some of the early comments, obviously supply is critical going forward. I think maybe just to take a slightly different slant and picking up on Wendy's earlier question, but then also connecting to some of these structural changes that we're seeing, and in particular the ESG agenda. So maybe taking a broader focus on the housing continuum. I think one particular area, because we've talked a lot about sort of more supply to service the needs of sort of non-subsidised housing, and I think if we look at, say, the existing waiting lists, if we look at, say, certain groups that are in particular need of stable and secure accommodation, you'd be looking at, say, Indigenous vulnerable groups, the working poor. Part of that solution is planning, zoning, but also part of it is all levels of government, private sector working together to develop those outcomes. And I think with the ESG agenda, what we've seen is that there's a lot of capital that wants to be deployed to subsidised housing. It's just a problem of not having enough projects on the other side, and that goes to the viability of projects because of the subsidised rents. So I think as a collective whole, across all levels of government, private sector, we need to work harder to improve those housing outcomes for the less fortunate Australians as well.
Okay, I think that segues well to a question that we have from the audience, from James Witten, who would like to ask, what are the panel's views on the market's ability to increase the supply of affordable housing through financial measures? For example, shared equity versus design and construction efficiencies. Susan, you spoke about build to rent. Would you like to comment first on this, and then maybe Zlatko?
I think there's a whole raft of things that we can do around that in terms of working out how to build cheaper and faster without compromising quality. We've experimented with various different programs to help people get into the housing market, a rent to buy scheme where people can rent and then we give them the rent back as a deposit when they come to the end of the rental, and that gets them into the apartment by having saved. And it's a way to get people into the market. It's been very effective in Perth, but we've done that. We have done, when the housing market in Sydney was particularly hot a few years ago, we ring-fenced some stock and said that only first home buyers who qualify for a first home buyer grant can even attempt to buy this apartment. And so it removed investors from the mix so that it gave a clearer runway for first home buyers. So there's a whole host of different strategies that we can use to try and get people into the market, because we recognise that it's often not servicing the mortgage, which is the problem. It's getting the deposit to get the mortgage, which is as fast as house prices go up, way faster than people's ability to increase their savings. So there's a whole area there around how to help people get into the housing market in the first place, when many people could support a mortgage. They just can't. They can't save while renting. I think that it takes the average couple on a median income 13 to 15 years to save a median deposit. That's a long time, and that's a Sydney stat. That we need to work out a way that if people want to get into the housing market, it doesn't take them 15 years to save for a deposit.
Zlatko, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, Churi, what we're really focused on is how we support companies like Mirvac to save costs. So frankly, we're developing a number of new products that are not only low carbon, but the one that we use in high rise called Envisia actually has early strength and low shrinkage characteristics that enable high rise buildings to be constructed faster, which obviously saves money as well. So coming up with product innovations like that don't compromise on quality, but speed execution, save the developer or the owner money is absolutely what we're focused on. And we have looked at methodologies like modular and precast. We'll continue to evaluate that. It hasn't proven economic for us at the moment, but I think it's a growing trend and something that we need to be exposed to.
Okay. I think we probably have time for one last question coming from the audience. And this goes back to the question that Wendy Hayhurst posed earlier about, I suppose, grand policy, but she posed on rental. So we have an upcoming budget and an election. What do you think are the key messages or priorities on housing for governments going forward? Zlatko, you're on. You may as well take that one.
Yeah, I think there's a couple. We've touched on a lot of the themes here, Churi. So look, I think supply and planning processes, and I appreciate they're mostly state-based, but I think there's a general theme across the nation. So, I'd love to see some actions in that place. And I'd love to see action around continuing support, particularly for first home buyers or lower income families to get onto the property ladder. And that doesn't necessarily need to be detached as it's been in recent years, but something that enables people to get a foot in the door, as Susan was describing, a rent to buy scheme or a build to rent approach. I think they're all valid approaches that industry is innovating on, but it'd be great to get some federal government support behind that as well.
Okay, Susan?
I think that those are absolutely the right points. The supply is a state issue, but there are things that the federal government can do to incentivise states to meet their housing targets. It's been done before around productivity payments. So there's definitely mechanisms whereby the federal government can incentivise housing targets. Working on city deals where we get all three layers of government working towards a common goal, such as the Western Sydney Airport is a great example of something that was governments at all levels coming together to really turbocharge a whole new city, and it is moving way faster than anybody expected in terms of demand for take-up of particularly logistics at this stage near the Western Sydney Airport. So city deals, complicated, yes, they are, but they are a really good way to stimulate activity in the market by getting all three levels of government cooperating.
Okay. And Nathan, perhaps you'd like to make a final comment on this.
Thanks for that one, Turi. Look, I think obviously as we go into a federal election, it's a good opportunity to debate and have all these issues considered. I do think probably I would just add local government, to the mix as well, given that state governments have been mentioned and potential role for Commonwealth. I think local government, and in particular, given it is at the coalface in terms of dealing with local communities, and the perception at times that amenity is compromised, I think it's really important to involve local government in these discussions as well. And obviously part of the planning process falls to them. So it's all levels of government, it's all across all society, including the private sector, if we're going to make some serious inroads into the supply issues that have been mentioned today.
Well, I think you're also talking about, some of the things that NHFIC's been doing, working also with the private sector, as well as with government on these issues. Okay. All right, I think we're just about to run out of time very shortly. So I would like to thank the panellists for their insightful questions today and the wonderful engagement we've had from you. Thank you to Susan, Zlatko, Nathan and you for your time and being willing to take out your crystal balls and have a go and talk about these things that are really impacting the housing markets across Australia and affordability, supply, demand and all the issues that most Australians are facing. A big thank you to our audience for their participation and questions and for making the time to join us this morning. We'll send a recording of the webinar to everyone who's registered to attend today, and we'll make also the webinar available on our website. So thank you to everyone today.